Welcome to the first of our webinar series that will be considering the question of femicide in the South African context. And the discussion as we're having it this morning is in conversation with an artwork by Penny Siopis, specifically her Patience on a Monument. So the work of Penny Siopis is useful insofar as she reminds us of the violence that defines South African society. Her work is even more useful as she compels us through this artwork to think carefully and critically about the place of women within a society defined by violence. As you will notice in the artwork, this composition is defined by an intriguing background that is reminiscent of a bloodied past that defines our reality as a country. The question that we are often confronted with in this artwork seeks to address the role and place of this violence in defining contemporary definitions in the country. In simple terms, is the violence that we are witnessing against women in the country symptomatic of a historical trauma captured, I would suggest, by Siopis in this artwork, or are we perhaps dealing with something completely different, as it were? Mine in the work we are doing today is not to answer these questions, but rather to facilitate a conversation that may consider these questions with more verve. Considering these questions in relation to a Black female musician's composition, Buselapi contends in a lamenting tone that the position to which she has been consigned is that, or is one that has been orchestrated rather by her father. This lamentation is heard beautifully in the claim, Ubaba udayise ngami kubafokazane, ngahlupheka, izizwe zonke zimbonile ubaba udayise ngami. The constant reference to a sense of despair that invites the lamentation from the artist seeks to challenge through musical form the imposed silences on women, women's bodies, and the move that would have us strip away the autonomy of women through culture and its attendant functionaries. The music is symptomatic of the music sung by the Zulu brides, or by the Zulu bride who contends with the challenge of being a newcomer MC, highlighting the claim that umendo awuthunyelwa kumbwa. The song can be read as a broader societal critique through a decolonial lens, a critique of the violence that defines the societal relations characteristic of dispossession and imposed colonial categories of thinking in our society. This was first attempted through my own scholarship in the paper entitled Defining an African Vocabulary. In view of these vexing questions, I am joined today by Lisa Vetten, who is a PhD fellow at Wits University. Lisa has worked in the field of violence against women for over 25 years in a range of capacities as a counselor, paralegal, trainer, researcher, and policy analyst. Along with Lisa, I am joined by Professor Sandy Africa, who is the Deputy Dean of Teaching and Learning in the Humanities Faculty at the University of Pretoria. Sandra, or Sandy Africa, is an Associate Professor in Political Sciences. She lectures in public policy as well as international relations in the subfield of Strategic and Security Studies. And last but not least, we are joined by Ntokozo Mbokazi, a postgraduate student at Rhodes University, my alumni. Ntokozo is a student of letters with a focus on representation and narrativization of Black masculinities as it pertains to consent, culture, and gender-based violence. Lisa, over to you for your presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, Siseko. So what I really want to do in this presentation is to reflect on the role of historicized understandings of homicide in particular in South Africa. And I want to link to some of the points that Siseko was making right at the beginning about ideas around democracy, violence, and how we understand the present through the lens of the past. And then what that means for the way in which we understand or try to develop policy in order to intervene with the problem of murder in South Africa. So just to begin with, I want to start off with President Ramaphosa's quote from 2018, and he said it most recently again last week. And this is the idea that there is a war against women in South Africa. In towns, small and cities large, in homes and schools, in colleges and universities, in our streets, our parks and open spaces, a war is being waged against women. Making the point that possibly nowhere in South Africa is safe. But what I want to do in this presentation is try to step away from this very strong polemical statement, because I think reading what people have to say, looking at the last couple of months, I think starting with Uyonene's murder, is I'm not sure we need any more polemics or outrage against intimate femicide and femicide or homicide more broadly. What I would like to really try and do here is try and step back a bit in order to see How do we convert our outrage into understanding? So I think we keep going through these cycles, and the time has really come for us to try and step back and understand what might be going on here. Are there different questions we should be asking if we want to really try and make some kind of change in what is happening in South Africa? So I think what I also want to do is we use and throw around the term gender-based violence quite a lot. And I want to be quite clear about what I mean and how I'm using it in this presentation. What I want to suggest and use in this presentation is something a little bit closer to the image on the right-hand side, which is a child's activity, but nonetheless, I think captures the central idea that gender is a category, it's a way of organizing it's a concept that organizes a whole range of ideas, and that it creates relations between these ideas. So just as we have the concept of a rainy day and what belongs in a rainy day, so is gender an organizing category in which we try to put in things that we think belong to the categories of gender that we have created. So that's how I really want to think about gender, not as a marker of identity, but as a relational category. I think very often, and this is a point I want to come back to again and again, we speak about it, especially in relation to patriarchy, as if we were talking about one timeless, ahistorical, decontextualized constant, that what we are dealing with is one repetitive, unbroken pattern of masculine domination. And I want to suggest that we need to nuance this. I mean, I've chosen two pictures here to just make the point that the picture on the left is a group of Black Panther activists from the late 1960s in the US. And on the right is a picture of Victorian ladies. Quite clearly, gender is not operating in the same way. History is making a difference. And I would like us to start thinking and taking seriously how history does make a difference. How does it shape what we are doing now, and whether we can continue to draw globalized, universalized explanations to explain phenomena that I would suggest are specific, local, and particular. So firstly, if we look at the 1990s, that was unquestionably an incredibly violent decade. 1993 was the peak. I don't think South Africa has ever recorded as many homicides as in 1993, and you can see the number was 78 per 100,000. We're coming off the back of, I think, very serious political conflict heading towards the transition, and that was certainly fueling the murders that we saw then. And by 2012, that number had more than halved. So we saw 30 per 100,000 then. So clearly we can see here the effects of changing circumstances, dynamics, and histories, and their impact on the reduction in murder rates. And this comes from police data. That trend has been reversed. And that is very concerning, because what is it that has changed in order to start pushing this, to reverse that downward trend and to start pushing it up again? So you can see in 2011-12, it reached its lowest at 15,544 homicides during that financial year. And then in 2012-13, it started climbing. And it has been climbing every single year since. So 2018-19, we had gone from 15,554 to 21,000. It's an increase of almost 6,000 homicides over that period. I think we're going to see a decrease in this financial year in the police report because of the lockdown. But I'm not sure if that we should be necessarily interpreting that as a reversal of what is clearly a trend. If we break this down further, now it's very difficult to actually get detailed, nuanced information about homicide in South Africa. It's much more of a patchwork. So it can be quite difficult to try and put together a kind of a set of historical trends so that one can see what is going on here. Here you'll see the figures for women, and then you'll see the figures on the extreme right as being the total numbers of homicide, and the figures as a percentage of a total reflect what percentage of women's murders every year form part of that overall total. And what I've also tried to put here in brackets is what is the year-on-year increase or decrease in the homicide rate. So what you can see is that while the overall homicide rate is increasing every year from between 343 to that very bad year in 2017-18, when it increased by over 1,000 murders, the figures for women seem to be doing something slightly more complex. I don't have figures for 14-15, so I can't say what the proportion of the increase is over the previous year. But you can see that some years it's increasing, some years it's decreasing, and in some years it's increasing again. So what I think that's telling us is that it could be telling us something about the problems of police statistics. I can't rule that out. But I think what it is also telling us is that what's driving the increase in relation to predominantly men's homicides may not be the same as what's driving the dynamics in women's homicides. But I think just if we try and put this in global context, and again, drawing on WHO estimates and rankings for 2016, which is the most recent data, how does South Africa compare? You can see that in terms of their data, we have the fourth highest rates. These are women's female interpersonal rates. We have the fourth highest rates in the world, which again parallels that for men. The figures for Honduras are really quite disturbing. They're almost 3 times the rates in South Africa. Jamaica and Lesotho are somewhat higher, and then we are located within that Guinea-Bissau and Haiti. What do these 6 countries have in common? That's quite difficult to know. Both South Africa and Jamaica are middle to upper middle income countries, whereas Honduras, Lesotho, Guinea-Bissau, and Haiti are considerably poorer. Honduras and Jamaica have very considerable gang problems, and that you can say certainly drives very significantly South Africa's male homicide rate. Some of our highest homicide rates, as people I'm sure are aware, are on the Cape Flats. So again, drugs and gangs are playing quite a significant rate, but that's very much a masculine pattern. It's very hard to understand what is the relationship then between that masculine pattern and what we see in relation to women. So now I think take another look at what is it that time has changed. And I think because we have this 10-year snapshot from the Medical Research Council's data, it's telling us what is shifting and what's altered between that 10 years. And I think it's perhaps pointing to what we might speculate is driving the increase now. So if we look at 1999, the rate was just over 24.7 women per 100,000, dropping to about 12 per 100,000. So you can see that has halved in that decade. But what decreased, what remained more or less the same is different. So if we look at 1999, non-intimate femicides accounted for 8.6 per 100,000. And when I talk about intimate femicides, I'm talking about murders committed by women's intimate partners. So when we talk about non-intimate femicides, they're all the homicides that fall outside of that category. So 8.6 per 100,000 in 1999, more than halved to 4.2 per 100,000. So that is statistically significant. So telling us that where we saw a very significant reduction in women's murders were those committed by men who are not their intimates. However, if we look at intimate femicide in 1999, 8.8 per 100,000 to 5.6 per 100,000 a decade later. That is not a statistically significant decrease. So while we can see that the rate of non-intimate femicides dropped quite sharply, that of intimate femicides is dropping much more slowly. So there we can see what was shifting, but what was not shifting. I think the other form of homicide where we can see that there wasn't a significant shift in that decade was sexual homicides or our rape homicides. We had 3.4 per 100,000 in 1999, 2.5 per 100,000. Again, not a significant decrease. What is significant, and I think starts to point towards how we might think about how do we reduce these numbers, is in 1999, the gun homicides. So the proportion of women killed with firearms was 7.5 per 100,000. By a decade later, it had decreased to 2.5 per 100,000. So a very significant decrease there. And there one could speculate that the difference was the introduction in 2000 of South Africa's Firearms Control Act. So I think, the one conclusion you might be able to draw from this is that regulating and controlling who has access to firearms can play a very significant role potentially in reducing women's homicides. So something to think about in terms of how do we prevent and reduce these numbers. I think now let's talk about COVID-19. So and I think the questions we might want to ask is, to what extent is the virus also a way to talk about gendered dangers? So if we look at the roughly 6-month period last year between 29th of March, 21st of May 2019, during that period there were 2,970 murders with 2,500 attempted. If we look at the lockdown, what happened? Well, murder was more than halved. So we see 1,072 murders happening during that 6-week period, with again a halving of those that were attempted. So I think the interesting question is, how was it that we paid no attention and took no notice of those 1,072 murders that occurred during stage 4 and stage 5 of the lockdown? Why have those passed almost without comment? So I think just in terms of moving towards a conclusion, there are very interesting ways in which we currently use crime and violence statistics in South Africa. And I do want to link to what Siseko was saying about democracy. I think when we use statistics, we often tend to abstract them from the larger context and from the history. And we tend to use them as political capital in ways that to make the state legible. And by that I mean the questions we asked in 2019 again now is, what is government doing? Why has government not got the problem under control? I want to suggest that that's the wrong question. There are things that government can, should, and ought to be doing that it's not doing, but it cannot by itself reduce the problem. And I think again, to return to Siseko's point, is that we do use violence against women to talk and think about democracy and democratization in South Africa and the nature of citizenship, and in highly gendered ways. I think often our line tends to be that democracy has not necessarily benefited women. And I do want to ask us to possibly think about how we can nuance that understanding. And I want to go back to some of the statistics that I presented. You will see that there is a significant disproportion in the number of men killed versus the number of women killed. So when we focus on who is victim, who is not victim, we are creating particular gendered discourses around victimization, who is vulnerable, who is seen as safe, and who is not. I think there are some political points that one needs to make about this. The first is the fact that more men are killed in South Africa than women are doesn't mean we now have to, as women, keep quiet and not protest. We don't have to wait, I think, until women's rates reach those of men's before we are allowed to protest. And I think this is also not a zero-sum game. The fact that one protests women's murders doesn't mean we now can't protest men's murders, or if we protest men's murders, that means we can't protest women's murders. It's not a zero-sum game. What we need to be trying to understand is, how is gender operating in terms of who we are paying attention to, how we are paying attention to them. And I think, interestingly, why is it that we continue to, with the very best of intentions, constantly construct women as victims, as those who should be fearful and anxious? When we ask, am I next? And I think if one reads social media and if one reads the articles that are being written, there is an enormous sense of fear, vulnerability, and anxiety being expressed by women. And that raises interesting questions as to why is that we continue to think about women in this way. And yet, if you look at the figures, if there is a group who should be staying home and should be asking, am I next? When am I going to be next? It is probably men. But why is it that we continue to construct women as vulnerable? What is it? What is the investment and the gain here in keeping women frightened all the time? So I think, we are to go back to what I was saying in the beginning, we are constructing gender in the way we speak and think about murder now. And it is a way to talk about relations between, not only just between men and women, but also between men and between women. Because the group who poses the greatest risk to women, young men, is also the group that poses the greatest risk to each other. Because if we look at men's homicide data, it is young men predominantly killing young men. The point I really want to focus on is really this question of how we are, or the point I was making previously with, how are we constructing gender right now? And how is it that we continue to speak about women in ways that emphasize their victimization? And who is it who can be the victim and who can be the oppressor? So I would like us to ask some questions around that. I think also ask some broader questions about, I have presented to you some of those figures that show how homicide rates have decreased over time, the fact that they're also fluctuating, and that they are also different in different parts of the world. So I think the conclusion we can draw from that, and this is very much, I think, a point we need to take forward in policy, is that quite clearly masculine domination is a necessary condition of women's murders, clearly it would need to be in place. But the fact that we can see variations across time and across geography means that it's not a sufficient condition. Clearly, there are other variables that are interacting with forms of masculine domination to create these fluctuations. And what are these? Clearly, there is a relationship between firearm access. But what else is going on? How do we understand what those other conditions are if we want to make inroads into the problem? And I raise this question because I think it's necessary for us to move beyond simply asking that we change gender norms. Quite clearly, there is more to this than simply changing gender norms. Gender norms is an important part of it, but that has to go with other things as well. And we need to perhaps think about, during that decade in which we saw those decreases between the 1990s to 2012, what was it that was changing then that produced those kinds of decreases? I think the other harder questions we have to ask are questions about representation. And these might be questions about whose lives are grievable. Why is it that, murder is quite clearly happening on an ongoing, constant basis. How is it that that passes us by much of the time? And what is it that some lives cause us to protest, cause us to grieve, and others don't? So who is it who can become the national subject? Who is it that we can see ourselves in? And who is it that we cannot see ourselves in? And I think, in terms of protest, who does not move us? Who do we simply accept continues to die? I think that, for an example, when I was yesterday looking at newspaper coverage, was coverage around homicides have been happening in Davidton. And we had a case there, the one case that they highlighted was simply described as a woman stuffed in a suitcase found under her boyfriend's bed. No name, no identity, just a body in a suitcase under a bed, which is in stark contrast, I think, to the list of 30 names that the president was reading out. I think the second question we need to ask is, what is the relationship between men's violence towards each other and towards women? Because this increase in violence, or these increases we're seeing in women's homicides, is largely moving in tandem or parallel with those between men. So the question I think that should ask us is, what is the relationship between the two? And if there is a relationship, what does it mean for how we address violence against women? Does it not also challenge us to think about, if there is a relationship between men's violence towards each other and their violence towards women, and the common denominator is clearly masculinity, are we effectively addressing it by only looking at what is being done, what men are doing to women? Do we not need to look at the relationship between violence and masculinity as a whole? That is a question I throw open. And I think, just in conclusion, how can we start moving towards feminist analyses of violence that don't just rely on these blunt dualisms? And I think also a static notion of patriarchy, that it was exactly the same as it was, that patriarchy worked in exactly the same way as it did in pre-colonial South Africa, as it did in colonial South Africa, as it did under apartheid South Africa, as it's doing now. I think we need something that is much more contextualized and much more nuanced, and that does start to take history seriously as well as context. So to be looking at both this recent presence as to what is driving these trends and how do we view those historically. So I'd like to end there with those questions.
Thank you very much. On the last question, I do think, although it's sort of an emergent area of research, there is some research that is paying attention to those nuances and those specificities with respect to masculinities. And I think about, for instance, some of the work that's coming out. If you think about that special issue that was done in Image and Text in 2018, analyzing Ingleba, right? So looking at the different and complex ways in which masculinity is being negotiated in the contemporary South African context and what that means. And I think what we take away from your contribution today is the idea that in many respects we ought to sort of think in more nuanced ways about the categories that we deploy when we are discussing gender-based violence within society, and not sort of have these bifurcating or these, as you say, dualistic kind of conceptions of gender-based violence. But I think the more interesting bit for me, in any case, is the historical question that you asked, which is to say, in terms of history, what changes and how do those changes influence our conceptions and understanding around gender-based violence and the representations both of masculinities as well as femininities within society. And with that, I'd like to invite Professor Africa to give us her contribution and thoughts to the debate.
So in preparing for the webinar, I reflected on the work and the research that has been done on national security policy in South Africa, and whether this research has prioritized the safety of women and feminized bodies, and how this agenda has impacted on the lived experiences of women. And I think Elisa has been correct in saying that we really need to move away from the static understandings of the answers to all these questions. So in the early 1990s, as we went into 1994, surely indeed the system of oppression, of exploitation, of patriarchy, of conflict that characterized society then was different to that which manifested as governments, perhaps 10 years into its making, 10 years later, was grappling with, that society was grappling with, was different to the kind of realities that obtain today, even though we still find ourselves in a society which is highly oppressive towards women and men, exploitative, still highly patriarchal, and where political contestation is still very much the order of the day, albeit taking different forms. What we do know is that whilst much has changed, much remains intact in our society. Poverty, racialized inequality, poor governance, patriarchy, institutionalized racism. And so whilst national security was reframed in the 1990s, quintessential questions remained throughout these years, these 25, 26 years of democracy. Security for whom, by whom, in whose interests, and by what means. The ethos around security may have changed, but in some senses, there are still continuities. There are discontinuities, but at the same time, continuities. So whilst we have a Bill of Rights in our Constitution, whilst we have a Chapter 8 that talks to the courts and the administration of justice, we have state institutions supporting constitutional democracy, whose functions are outlined in Chapter 9. We have a new paradigm for the use of force outlined in Chapter 11 on the security services. These institutions and measures, these instruments have not been entirely successful in addressing the problems of governance, in addressing, well, the very issue that we are dealing with in this seminar, this webinar today, and that is the problem of homicide, and particularly the problem of femicide. And in fact, as the initial thinking, as I understand it, that prompted this debate raised the question of whether what we are seeing in the extreme violence that is a femicide prompts us to ask whether these conditions do not amount to a kind of genocide. I think this is what may have been asked of us when the question was posed, whether in fact the homicides that we are seeing against women do not pose such an extreme emergency that they call for the responses that mass atrocity crimes, as captured through treaties and understandings, both at the global level and domesticated in law, sometimes require us to examine through new lenses. And so, whilst agreeing very, very strongly, because the evidence is there for us to see that the homicide rate generally far outmatches that of the femicide rate, and agreeing with the postulation that this is no reason why we should not isolate femicide as a specific question of public debate and requiring policy responses. The question, and I do this not, from any deep understanding of what the international legal implications of this might be. The question that we might also want to be answering here is whether what we are seeing is so extreme that it requires us to advance our definitional paradigm to that of asking whether we are not seeing a phenomenon that is genocidal in its nature. And I also then want to turn to the COVID pandemic and the way in which language has been instrumentalized, not necessarily gendered through my contribution. This is not my contribution to question the gendered nature of the way in which we are viewing the pandemic, but rather the militarized sense in which the responses have been framed. So right at the outset, President Ramaphosa and the Command Council have invoked the language of war against an enemy, as they put it, the coronavirus. So measures taken have included setting up a command council, redirecting resources, suspending liberties, deployment of the security services. And whilst they were instructed to use a velvet glove, so to speak, we've often seen that it has been an iron fist that they have inflicted. And to a large extent, it would appear that society has tolerated this. International coordination, so these daily briefings that we see about what the virus is doing where and what the kind of responses have been in vaccine and treatment development. So the state and the president have taken on this warrior-like stance in defeating or combating, and the language used has in fact been the language of combat. We need to ask whether this is appropriate and what this in fact might actually have translated to in the way in which public policy responses now and in the future to social problems has been and means. Certainly, there's been an attempt to also impose this language of a pandemic, requiring a response, an all-society response to it. But I think that there has been a differently nuanced language when gender-based violence has been approached. I would argue that the president has, and cabinet and policymakers have appealed to our our better nature, to our better selves in dealing with this. There's almost been an apologetic stance that has characterized the way in which the responses are couched, and we are encouraged to do the right thing. So the president pleads with the men of the country to do better, to join the fight. Which is it to be? Are we to be warriors against gender-based violence, or are we to ramp up our better natures, better selves, in order to disrupt the patterns that are before us? I have some sympathy for the way in which it is couched, because I think that it is going to be collectively that the issues are addressed. Our alternative paradigms must involve societal responses, must involve solidarity, but at the same time, they have to involve reviewing the way in which security is conceptualized, so that it is in fact gendered. But in addition, it should be it has to be demilitarized. It has to emphasize the justice component. It has to ensure that accountability is at the heart of what is offered to women who face this scourge and this problem. I want to say that the responses that national security policy has offered are clearly, it may the rhetoric, security, do require an in public policy toolkit, if I may put it that way, has led to these peaks and troughs, have led to the successes to the extent that there may have been successes. Gun control may have been one. The passage of laws against domestic violence, the passage of laws relating to sexual offences, the victories that women have actually scored over the years may all have contributed. But it does seem as though there has been too much of a spasmodic and periodic, and certainly not a sustained and foregrounding of how indeed to tackle the deep issues of systemic patriarchy in the current context of poverty, of unemployment, of racialized inequality, which women really bear the burden of in our society, in how we frame security. And that this certainly is something for research agendas in the future and current times to put at the center of what they are seized with. And I think I'll stop at this point.
Professor Africa, thank you very much for that contribution. One of the things that you point to here, Sandy, is the question of where or how it is that we are sort of using language in public discourse to respond to a problem and a challenge. And from what we understand from Lisa's contribution, is the idea that maybe there might be, we might be not asking the right kinds of questions, which then leads us to the use of curious language that maybe might be misframing the conversation in many respects. So thank you very much for that contribution. And I do think, as you say, a lot of the work that needs to happen, and this is part of the sort of agenda with regards to this webinar series, is to say, as the politics department at the University of Pretoria, we're taking an active and responsive kind of call towards some of the challenges that we're experiencing in society, positioning, of course, the University of Pretoria as a responsive institution. And now I would like to invite my dear friend and colleague, Ntokozo Mbokazi, to give us his input and his thoughts around the topic. Ntokozo, over to you, sir.
Good afternoon. I trust everybody is well. Before I begin, I'd like to sort of point everyone's attention to a book which was released yesterday called Becoming Men by Molose Langa. It's an interesting book, and I think Lisa has to say about how we engage with violence and masculinities, and also what she had to say about the static structure of gender and fixed notions of gender. This is a topic that for me has been one that has preoccupied my research and my thinking for a long time. And I think we need new men. I think, which is an allusion to obviously Unobale Bulawayo's book, We Need New Names, which is an amazing read. You should pick it up. We need alternative representations of how men become men. We need, as a society, to be able to reimagine and imagine a manhood which does not seek violence to articulate itself. I think an amazing point which has been raised here today is that not only are men killing women, but they're killing themselves. I think an additional point to that would be that the raids, particularly in 2016 by the World Health Organization, showed a very large disproportionate suicide rate between men to women at a rate of at least 4-1, you know. So as much as there may be a temptation to suggest that the natural state of men is a static one, a violent one, a dominant one, we have historically seen the society play a role in changing how we conceive men, you know. We have a society today, I think, which takes particular exception to absent fatherhood. And we can appreciate the history of a country with migratory practices, which fractured a lot of homes and left a lot of homes without fathers. But I think what this sort of shows is that as a society, we are able to recreate and reimagine the roles that we put men and women and children in. And I think this moment calls for a new man. So my focus as a literary scholar is to consider representation and narrativization, to consider the ways in which we as a society construct men in text, in television, in music, in advertisements. And I wonder if we are articulating men, or rather representing men as having violence as being one of their only avenues of distress, of articulating distress. And I think we are. Now, as I say this, I do think that it is important to take into account the historical factors, you know, which are afflicting many men, and the contemporary factors as well. So we still have a predominant amount of single parent households in Black and color communities. We still have mental health practices which are not probably the best or the most helpful, perhaps. You know, we still have the results of the apartheid spatial planning and the ghettoization of an entire peoples, which has facilitated gangsterism. You know, we still have low education completion, and I bring up these factors not what is occurring in the way that we have constructed and configured manhood, that when it collaborates with these factors, it produces the violence that we're seeing. You know, what stories are we telling of men? What stories are we showing of men in TV and in movies and in billboards and in advertisements? If perhaps we have a relationship between gender-based violence and alcohol consumption, then perhaps we as a country should move away from representing alcohol consumption in our advertisements as accentuating essential manhood. You know, these are very serious conversations around the representations and the avenues we're giving men to become and to form themselves to be. You know, and we've done it as a society for the idea, at least, of women. You know, we've been able to shift the imagining of the woman's role as being purely domestic, and we've been able to represent on TV and in books a woman who's able to lead the boardroom, a woman who's able to be, you know, the CEO at the same time. There's this amazing show on television right now called I think it's called Ikomora. And the lead detective is a woman in that show, and the hijacking crime syndicate, who the person who runs it is a woman in that show, and one of the hijackers is a woman. So these are traditionally oppositional views to what we as a society have constructed women to be, and yet we are representing them, perhaps not the best way because they're committing crime. But all I'm suggesting is that, are we doing enough representational and narrative work as a society to show alternative ways of being, and alternative ways of being which are also then valued by the society at large and by the boys who participate in that society? You know, Ulanga, in that book, Becoming Men, points to how his research has unpacked Black township men who are living out alternative forms of masculinity. And what he means by alternative is, of course, non-violent, non-sexist, non-risk-taking. But what he also laments is that they find that they have no alternative versions of masculinity to then pursue. You know, and we obviously know that a lot of men growing up have these violent heroes, although the violence is rooted in justice. You know, we have your Supermans and your Batmans, and you have all these superheroes, but essentially the mold that manhood takes is one which articulates itself violently when it feels that it's being transgressed. You know, a very strong thematic articulation by men is "I manindota," right? Which is what men will often say in response to their manhood being challenged, but it is also a threat. You know, it is also a threat which suggests that, I think I've disappeared. Have I disappeared? You know, it is also a threat when a man says that. And so for me, I take seriously this idea of reconstituting, reimagining, reconfiguring what we see men as. You know, what is the fundamental pillar of manhood? And I'm certain that violence and domination and power are three things that men will often see themselves as. And I don't want to make the mistake of having one monolith of masculinity and manhood. You know, I think there've been a lot of feminist work that has been done to articulate. There's been a lot of work which has been done to articulate the various types of feminist thought, whether it be white feminism or Black feminism or African feminism. And in the same way, I think we do need to appreciate Zubuti. There is sort of the township, you know, feminism, as Ukupano Ratela and Kopano Malose and Ulanga Malose have said. And there is also the boys' school type of masculinity. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Mr. Kumalo went to Maritzburg and I went to King Edward, and we can attest to the active manufacturing of these patriarchal, violent, power dominant identity centers, you know. And so for me, that becomes a massive preoccupation, a massive project that we as a society do need to take forward. You know, are we putting enough versions of men out there that men can become? You know, in our stories, in our television, in our advertisements, are we allowing space for alternative versions of men who do not feel the need to articulate themselves violently?
and who do not construct their image and configure their sense of self through power domination, to react violently when that power is then transgressed, you know. A subset of my work, or the focus of my work right now, deals with consent, and how the story of consent is a further sort of expansion of the way in which we are positioning manhood and womanhood, and masculinity and femininity. You know, we have the traditional trope of consent, which is obviously to be pursued by the masculine, and we have this idea that the female is supposed to reject and sort of have this coy role. But essentially what's happening is that we have a yes in that instance, or rather a no from the female turn into a yes. You know, we've seen this happen multiple times where no does not essentially mean no, right? And it's sort of an invitation to the masculine to pursue, right? And I concern myself with that erosion of agency, which then comes to fruition in the bedroom, you know, where we've had so many no's turn into yeses, that once we get to our moments of intimacy and this space that manhood has sort of inculcated this body to believe is what their validation is constituted of, right? How they can access the sexual space, and accessing the sexual space validates their identity, and they are powerful and they are violent, and they get to the sexual space, and we've created this dynamic where agency can be negotiated and is negotiable in the sort of courtship space. You know, consent is something that one can negotiate away with. Then you get to this final space and you have a no and you have a yes, and it becomes, you know, a very dangerous space. It becomes a very dangerous space. So we keep portraying consent in this way that it is this task that has to be maneuvered and navigated, you know, and it must be maneuvered and navigated by these individuals who identify as violent and powerful and who articulate themselves that way. And their identity is also heavily constituted on how much sex they can have, you know. And we bring these two things together a lot of the time. And a lot of the time we have these instances where in connection to femicide, we have women who feel raped, sexually violated, because I think the femicide umbrella is one which is of that, right? It includes sexual violence, it includes rape. And the way in which we're navigating consent, the way in which we're navigating manhood, and the identities in which we're articulating for men, and the institutions that we protect, which keep reproducing these identities, like very popular boys' schools. I think if we're going to have a serious conversation about femicide, we need to look intimately at the men that we are constructing, the men who are also at risk highly disproportionately of suicide, and the men who are also killing each other, you know, as has been stated in this talk. So we have bodies that are particularly violent, and they respond violently to discomfort, you know, emotional discomfort, economic discomfort. And how do we, as a society, begin the work that we have done previously in how we imagine women and how we imagine men's relationship to their children? How do we start to do the same work when it comes to men?
Thank you very much for that contribution that you made, Ntokozo, because I do think it compels us, or it pushes us in many respects to start reimagining our responses to a number of the societal problems that we're faced with when we are considering the question of gender-based violence. I've got a question for each of our panelists, and I'll start off with Lisa. And Lisa, as I said earlier, in terms of the contribution that you made to this conversation, you're suggesting a more nuanced kind of debate or a nuanced conversation with respect to femicide in the South African context. And I wonder, as Professor Africa has suggested, that the work that we were trying to do with this particular symposium, or these webinar series as it later became, was to try and understand whether or not we're being hyperbolic, for instance, in equating the scourge of gender-based violence, i.e. femicide in South Africa, to a genocide against women, right? And part of the work that we were doing was in collaboration, or was thinking through some of the definitions, as it were, that have come up around the question of genocide, and whether we have too minimal a definition of genocide, or maybe we're being too generous with our language when it comes to the question of genocide and equating the crimes that we're seeing against women as a genocide against women. And I wonder if you can give us a thought or two around that.
I think, when it comes to questions of definition, the important starting point is, what is the context in which you would use this definition? If you want to use it within a legal framing, no, you could never say this is genocide. And I'm not even sure you could legally make work a separate, distinct definition of femicide either. That's in terms of the law. The way our law works, you would need to have particular elements, you need to show particular kinds of intention. And I think one of the difficulties that is sometimes thrown up by a question of femicide is the definition originally was based on which emerged, I think, from about the mid-80s, was really about the idea that it emerged from men hating women. And I think the paradigmatic examples were sexual serial killing, where victims were clearly being targeted because they were representing something feminine that was clearly despised and hated by the men who killed under those circumstances. But I think it's obviously then grew to a recognition that actually it's more likely that women, although we focus a great deal on stranger danger, women are at much greater risk of being hurt in a range of ways from the men with whom they are familiar, their neighbors, their family, their intimate partners. So what's been kept, or I think what femicide does is it should ideally, I think, help us think analytically and conceptually, that what it's trying to point to is precisely the nature of gender and gender relations, which is why people then grapple with, when you have a woman who is killed in a hijacking, should we call that a femicide simply because the hijacker was male and the victim was female? And in many instances, and I think it's that kind of example where how to think about femicide really comes under strain, because people will then say, well, what are the gender dimensions of that? What does it tell us about gender relations, and why, if men are so much more likely to be killed in hijackings because hijackers see them as a greater threat than women, is that not an example of gender being in operation? So the question of motivation and the question of gender become quite difficult to figure out from a legal point of view. I think these definitions perhaps are more useful when you are trying to conceptualize, analyze, and think about what is going on here. Conceptually, can we think about this as war, and can we think about this as genocide? I don't think so. There is a part of me that is uncomfortable with, and this goes to the points I was making earlier about how are we constructing gender, that says what is happening to women is war, but what is happening to men, we're not even going to protest about. We're not even going to present statistics about, and we're not even going to talk about it. I find that ethically uncomfortable if I look at the numbers. And again, I want to underscore the point that I'm not suggesting that, women have to have the same numbers as men. But within a context and where we are constructing gender, I am uncomfortable with that. I'm also uncomfortable trying to shift this into the language of gender. In order to convey its seriousness, we have to use militarized language of war and genocide. Why do we have to do that? Why can this not be a phenomenon in its own right, that we can think about using its own concepts and terms without trying to squeeze and fit it into something that is borrowed and that is militarized? Because I think Professor Africa was making a very good point when she talked about, if you start to use the language of militarization in relation to this, what are we suggesting? That women go out and arm themselves against men? Is that the option? Is that the way in which we engage in terms of trying to address this as a problem? So no, I don't think war and genocide are helpful. I think we need somewhat different analytical lenses and concepts in order to grasp what is going on here.
Thanks for that, Lisa. And this takes me then to my second question for Professor Africa. Sandy, I'm curious about, as you say, there is some work that's already been done at the moment in terms of the South African context with respect to legislation and with respect to some of the laws that we have in the country. But you do mention that in some respects there's some work that still needs to be done. I wonder then if we're doing enough, and if we can sort of tag on to what Lisa's suggestion was there earlier, which is to say that this is not necessarily This is not necessarily a war against women. This is not a genocide. And we need to find new ways, or new ways of discussing these of discussing this phenomenon. And I wonder if that comes from having to develop the necessary policy infrastructure that gives us a lexicography that understands and analyzes this problem in and of itself with its own merits, and not attempting in many respects to pad on to this phenomenon using other discourses and other language, as it were.
I often feel that we need to move beyond the point of policy definition, policy making, to examining what is wrong with our policy implementation. I also think that we need to move beyond the stage of viewing the state as the primary vehicle through which the changes that society needs is going to come about. So I think we must applaud what the Department of Justice is doing. It's done. There will always be questions about whether the resources are adequate, and I would say that they aren't, but this goes so much for the entire architecture of the state. Why is it that, in a country of 56 million or so people, the numbers of shelters for abused women don't run into the thousands? Why is it that the rate at which prosecutions actually result in successful convictions are very pathetic? Why is it that the administration of justice is so under-resourced? And I made the comparison with how everything is being thrown at the invisible coronavirus, and with good reason. Yes, it kills. But so does so much else that we are faced with as a society. So I do think that the reprioritization of resources, more serious attention to lawmaking that is evidence-based and carrying through on it so that there's effective implementation of the laws is one side to what needs to happen. But I want to agree that it is actually within society's hands, and here to align myself with the view that creating new representations is fundamental to changing these patterns that we observe. So yes, we must forever hold the state and the police and the Department of Justice and whoever else has been given responsible to account for what they failed to do. But much rests with how in which society reconstitutes itself. And this is going to be a conflictual process. This is going to be, as it was in the case of women and society, that part of it which supported the struggle for new representations of women, to actually win the day and to get laws on the table, to get new ways of seeing women in popular culture, in the workplace, and so onwards. I think it is going to actually take a new era of conflict, stroke resistance by those men and women who see this as an important political and public policy agenda for that to happen. It's not going to sit it's not going to happen if we sit back and fold our arms. It's not going to happen if we're waiting for someone to do it. So the writers, the artists, the scientists who actually put the notion of a new man on the table are going to be the ones who actually lead that charge. We are in a very advantageous position in being in a partnership with the departments of justice and other state institutions, where we can lend the resources of the university to this. We can hopefully encourage refocusing of our agendas, our artistic, our creative agendas, so that they lend themselves to this, so that when you look up at a billboard, you see this new man. When you read the book, that's what's out there in hundreds of thousands of set works that boys and girls are reading in schools. So I do think that organization and leadership become very important in actually taking forward this track, and that organization and leadership, as it was in the case with the women putting down their feet and insisting that the state does something about gender-based violence last year, August and September, as Lisa refers to. I really do think that it calls for leadership and organization to make these realities happen. So yes, I think that there's probably a lot more that can be done in the legal and public policy space, in as far as lawmaking, policy making is concerned. But I do think that the kind of societal dynamics are so constituted that it is going to take some measure of resistance and organization and leadership to disrupt them, to allow these new forms of being and relating to emerge.
Absolutely, and thanks for that. Thanks for that, Professor. Which takes me to my third question for my third panelist, Ntokozo, where I am curious, Ntokozo, you talk to this concept of, or you sort of remind us of what is it? No Violet Bulawayo's work, where she says we need new men. And I'm curious about the work of developing these new men, right? In the sense of, where does this work happen, right? Does it happen in the novel? Does it happen in the cinema? Does it happen? And when this work, by the way, does happen, and I think about, again, to go back to Ingleba, which was released in 2017, and the public outrage in many instances that film solicited as a result of the kind of subject matter that it was dealing with, right? So I wonder what the possibilities are of the reinvention, right, of manhood within our society. And there's been a number of these, of course, if you think about Squirn Hate, for instance, that film that came out, I think it was in 2013, if not in 2011, which also sort of cast a very different kind of image towards the question of masculinity as it is manifested in what we would understand as conservative Afrikaner identity and culture. You think about Canary, which also came out quite recently. And again, the kinds of public responses that we get to these reimagined or these repositioned conceptions of manhood within society. And I wonder what that has to say, or what that says to us about our public allowances for a reconception and a new understanding of what manhood, the category of manhood, can look like within society. And I wonder if you can say something to that effect.
The idea of a cleanly, hygienic man is no longer seen as feminine, is no longer seen as something outside of the gambit of what manhood is, right? It's not outside of the remit of manhood now. And so how was that accomplished, right? Well, I imagine that there was a lot of sort of capitalistic endeavor that was in, you know what I mean, that was profited from that. So we need men to buy these products so that we can make more money. But it worked, however you want to spin it. This idea that men get manicures, this idea that men be clean, this idea that men spend a significant amount of money to look a certain way, is one that met a lot of resistance, you know, in typical male fashion, or rather in the typical sort of cult of patriarchy. It was immediately ascribed as being homosexual, and then it received its own share of homophobic sort of, you know, responses. But that's just one example in which we've been able to change a narrative which before received much pushback. You know what I mean? And so I don't think, and this is why I made the point about it's dangerous to create this monolith of masculinity and say, well, this is Ubudot and this is how we're going to respond to it, right? And I made the allusion to a lot of other works within feminist theory which have allowed us to appreciate the sort of striated and different types of feminism required. And in the same way, there are different types of masculinities, you know, and so different types of masculinities are going to need different types of engagement, right? We had the same sort of uproar when white feminists said, well, this is what we're going to do. We need to stop doing this, stop cooking, stop. And then you have black feminism, which is, well, that's not necessarily the avenues that maybe we would like to take in order to articulate our sense of equality, you know? So the different type of imagining and reconstituting for men like you and me, middle class Black men who came from boys' schools, you know, might not look the same as sort of the township boy that Kopano Ratlele speaks of, you know, and we do need to be aware of that before we start to chart this reconstitution, and we need to be aware of why then certain masculinities would be unacceptable to certain individuals, you know.
Thanks for that, Ntokozo, because, you know, it says something, I think, which we tend to forget when we're having these conversations, which is to say that there are different positionalities that come to the conversation, right? And this, in some respects, links me back to Lisa's question, which I think was a very poignant question, which is also one of the reasons why I was inspired to do this kind of work, because every single year, right, there's one woman who makes the headlines in society because she's been brutally murdered, either by an intimate partner or by a stranger or something of the nature. And a lot of the work, when I was sort of, when we were conceptualizing this work initially, this particular webinar series now, was to say we were trying to get to a point where in 2020 we don't have another woman who is faced with this particular challenge. And just last week, we see the case of Tsogofatso Pule up here in Gauteng, right? And Lisa asks a fantastic question. She says to us, you know, she asks this question of the visibility, right? So which particular bodies are seen, which particular women make the news headlines, and why it is that those particular women make the news headlines. And Lisa, I'm just going to invite you for 2 minutes, because we've got questions that are coming in now. For 2 minutes, I'm just going to invite you to share something around that, right? In the sense of, are there any sort of preliminary ideas around what it is that qualifies particular bodies within society, or particular women who have been murdered quite brutally and violently, to make the headlines, right? And to be characterized as I suppose, the poster child of these kinds of conversations and these kinds of debates. Do you care to share some thoughts on that?
Yes, I would. I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I think some of this belongs to much older trajectories around the representation of women. I think, and this possibly for those who work in art, you would be able to give more detail around this. I think there is a long and morbid history of representing dead, beautiful women. And I think what is striking about the women who have garnered the most attention and public outrage over the last few years is that they are all young and beautiful. It is very interesting when I go through the newspapers and I look at who remains at the level of a woman's body versus who becomes a name and a picture and a hashtag. That seems to be very prominent. That is not new. As I said, you can find that there's some very interesting historical work that's been done around, particularly say, the Romantic artists and their preoccupation with painting dead, beautiful women. But But I think that is something that we have to ask about, is the degree to which somebody who is photogenic and of whom images exist of them and can be circulated take on that realm. So I think there are questions here about how social media facilitates those who can be represented and those who can't. So I think there are other questions we can ask here about inequalities of attention. Who has access to Instagram? Who has access to Twitter? Who can be represented? Who is not on those platforms and cannot be represented? I think there are some very interesting questions here being worked out around democracy and its promise. I mean, I'd like to take people back, if people can think back, if you were born then, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And again, it was a time of virus. And that was the emergence of HIV/AIDS in South Africa, and the first sign of how staggering the extent of the epidemic in South Africa had become. The emphasis then was on men raping babies. And you could, if you want to think of this in a more representational way, say that the rape of the baby and the child at a stage when you have this, at the dawn of democracy, a new society being built, is very much a way of exploring what is the kind of masculinity we've brought into democracy. And in the child and the baby is the representation of our fears about what is happening to the birth, to the youth, to the childhood, to the promise, to the future of our democracy. And so now, if I think about it, if we look at the ages of who it is who typically makes the headlines, there would also be young women who would have been born after 1994 or around about that time. So it's another way, I think, to look. And if we focus on youth, it's again, we are often also asking is questions about our future. What is happening to our future? I mean, I think that's the difference between why older individuals don't make the news as much, is because they raise different questions. They don't raise questions about our future. Where are we going? How hopeful can we be? What is happening to us as we go forward? So I think, as in the 1990s, the focus was on children and babies. If we look at where we are now in democracy, that seems to be very much the age of who we focus on. And again, these questions of future, now, what are the men? What is the past? So I think there's some complex questions here about democracy, about beauty, that we need to look at who has access to what, that we need to think about quite critically, and who attracts attention.
And thanks for that, Lisa, because you remind me of Drusilla Cornell's scholarship, where she talks to the question of aligning the ethical with aesthetics, right? And the whole idea of the question of democracy and non-violence, right? So for those who might not know, Drusilla Cornell is a feminist philosopher, feminist scholar, and she does quite some interesting work around the question of feminism and democracy as it relates to the question of citizenship and participation within said democracy. And she develops this beautiful schema in that collection of essays that came out in 1995, where she talks to this idea of, as I say, an alignment of the ethical with aesthetics, such that in many instances we are able to relate to each other in non-violent ways. I've got a question here that's come in, which I'm going to pose to my Deputy Dean, Professor Africa. There's a question here from Cass Prinsloo, who asks the question of, would more formalized and targeted preparation for parenthood be a good strategy in the longer term in terms of normalizing gender identities and behavior, perhaps along with more constructive, substantive curriculum content in education and schools? And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but I wonder if you would have a thought or so around this idea of, in many instances, capacitating even the question of sort of nurturing this future democracy, right? In the sense of how it is that we relate to our children, how it is that we relate to our children in respect to the question of identities, gender identities, as that constitutes our broader democratic project as a country.
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I mean, I'm inclined to. I know that it's coming from a place where the question is it possible to mediate, regulate a policy response to parenting? What should parenting look like? But I think it's important for us to start from the departure point that, in fact, parenting, be it motherhood, fatherhood are socially constructed anyway. They are highly contextual. How families are formed are, in fact, a representation of social dynamics playing out over time. And I think that we all, it's been said, that we're coming from a past and a history where different economic, political interventions have in fact formed societies, relationships between caregivers and children, between men and women in relation to the family, whatever that might be, has taken particular forms, and that is continuing to play itself out over time. So I think the first thing is for us to be able to understand what these different variants of family are, what notions of fatherhood and motherhood, of parenting indeed, are playing themselves out in relation to reality. And I suppose what then is necessary is to hold these up against what kind of human rights, I suppose, abrogations they may come up against. So a family constituted of two caring women bringing up a child is, I would say, a social good of two caring men of a single parent. And we do know that a large number of households are headed by women in South Africa, and quite successfully so. So I think that if it is indeed an inclusive notion of what parenting means, that parenting does not need to conform to a prototype, but instead should be weighed against whether it is a relationship, a relational dynamic which contributes to the well-being in all its meanings of a child, then indeed that's provision of support to parenting is something which policy interventions should in fact support. And I think to a large extent this is happening. We see it in the way in which laws are being cast and recast to be more inclusive. But at the same time, there is the resourcing, there are the social norms that actually militate against that, which does bring me up against back to the question of what kind of active interventions and in what forms these should be mediated. So in essence, my answer would be yes, but let us have a more inclusive notion of parenthood, realizing that in fact that this is a shifting definition, and that one's identity, if ever there is, as a parent, can actually take multiple forms.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sandy. And I've now got a question that I'd like to sort of share between Ntokozo and Lisa, and then I'll give and I'll give both Lisa and Ntokozo 2 minutes between the two of them, and then I'll ask my speakers, starting with Prof. Africa, to sort of just give some concluding thoughts after Lisa and Ntokozo have answered this particular question. So we've got one question that comes in from Kathleen Jennings, a graduate as well, from a graduate student from Rhodes University, who will actually be joining us for the second of our webinar series. And she asks a poignant question to Ntokozo, which is to say, there was a seminar that was held at Rhodes University, which she found to be problematic in the sense of it was a space that was constituted as a male-only space, as it were. And the question then is the question of, in terms of conversations around consent and repositioning said consent, does Ntokozo feel that such men-only spaces are useful in taking the conversation forward, or are such conversations as curated as being constituted only of men perpetuating a particular narrative? Ntokozo, do you have a word or two to say around that? And then finally, before you answer, Ntokozo, I'd like to take a question as well from Anima McBrown, who raises a very, very useful task or very useful question around this idea of reimagining manhood and the task of the reimagination of manhood. And I want us both, Ntokozo and Lisa, to give us some thoughts around this, to say, what does the project of the reimagination of manhood suggest for the democratic project? Because at the end of the day, this is one of the critical things that we've got to think about, which is to say, how do we collectively as a society, irrespective of our differences, build a society that each and every single individual can find to be safe as well as welcoming, and a space that I would suggest upholds the inherent human dignity of all within society. But Ntokozo, over to you first on the question of male-only spaces.
I appreciate that question, particularly because I facilitated one of those spaces. And one of those spaces was an initiative driven by me. So I'd like to give you the background of why, and then perhaps we can delve into its functionality and the success thereof, or lack of success thereof. So at the time, what we had happening was a sort of global, I think it was around 2015, 16, right? So we had a conscientization, if you will, of large student bodies. And we had the term wokeness was sort of starting to make its way into the public space, you know, and wokeness became a term initially, I think, to suggest an awareness of the intersectional practices of the world, becoming aware of how certain people have to navigate certain privileges, etc., certain oppressions. But what I was starting to pick up with wokeness was that they became a performativity, because people who were not participating, people who were not on the right side of wokeness were often antagonized, were often it became a very cantankerous and just pugnacious space, you know. So what I was seeking to do was to make a room available for men who felt as though their views would be seen as problematic, but they did not understand why their views were problematic. And so the space was meant to dig out and accentuate the problematic ways that men feel about women's bodies and about consent, in a way which they would not have the burden of performativity of being, you know, sort of what was morally in vogue perhaps at the time.
So if I could just ask a question on that particular notion, sort of tagging on then to Kathleen's question. I'm curious, when we're having these conversations, what are the possibilities, right, of men bringing their problematic conceptions of women's bodies or their conceptions of women and their relate? How welcoming are we of men who have or who hold those views, to bring them into particular spaces such that they can get, such that we can facilitate a space that is educative for them to change their views in many instances, right? So, and this then of course leads me to that concept of, should we be able to create these spaces where men can feel safe to bring problematic behavior into those spaces, such that they can be able to interrogate those problematic conceptions without necessarily feeling this judgment or this moral sort of damnation, as it were, that would come from those who would be woke within the room, who would sort of want to silence their lack of understanding, if we can call it that.
Look, I think those spaces are vital, and I wanted them because we all know that a lot of people, particularly people who have a social mobility, socioeconomic mobility, know what to say, right? They know what to tweet, they know what to, but these are the very men who are perpetrating these abuses, you know? In fact, I'm pretty certain that Kinsani's abuser was at the references protests, you know, and I'm pretty certain that there's another gentleman, I'm not sure about the legality of mentioning his name, but he was also there and he's been found to be, you know, an abuser. And so we know that there's also a region of performative correctness, right? But what that space allowed, and the only criticism that I would level, and that was leveled at me about the space, is that it's good men getting better, right? It's good men who are willing to say, you know, hey, if she's drunk and I'm drunk, is that still rape, right? So men who are willing to come there and have these conversations. But we weren't sure if we were opening the space up to men who weren't already within the varsity space, right? Men who weren't already sort of within the space of epistemic privilege, as it would be, you know. And that would be a definite criticism, and I wasn't able to sort of to figure that part out. But it was helpful purely in the sense that you were able to appreciate what we now have sort of spoken about with regards to consent being able to be withdrawn. You know, at any point in time, if you're having sex, someone can say stop and you stop. And there were men who didn't know that. There were men who contested this. You know what I mean? There were men who spoke about their rights to continue if they had bought this or bought that, and sort of initiated the sexual encounter. So I don't think, in fact, I'm certain those conversations would not have been had that explicitly and that honestly had we had women within the space. Because what happens is that the libidinal economy takes center stage, and men are more concerned about whether they will still be able to have good and sexual relations with the women who were there, and not as concerned about whether they're able to actually do the work, you know?
Yeah, and Ntokozo, just as a concluding remark, so and apologies for putting on stage here, but as a concluding thought, the question of the reinvention of manhood for the purposes of fostering or developing a democracy that is able to hold in tandem competing and even conflictual identities. Literally 30 seconds, because I've got to run through all the speakers before concluding at 1 o'clock.
I think it's been said by all three speakers, and I think what's important for us to remember with regards to femicide is that men are not only killing women, but they're killing everything, you know. And I think that can, you know what I mean, they're killing themselves, they're killing each other, and they're committing suicide, and they're killing women, you know. So right now, the way we've constituted manhood is the most dangerous thing to our democracy, right? They're killing trans people, they're killing non-binary people, they're killing queer people. So it is imperative, right? Now, who, and I saw the question, who the work belies upon is going to have to be on all the levels that we've spoken about, right? How do we change the prosecutorial narrative around rape? And how do we perceive rape within the legal framework? And how do we have these conversations when men get to universities? And what type of men are we producing from boys' schools? And what type of ways are we allowing township masculinities to explore themselves differently? You know, I think the current version, the current configuration of manhood might be the most dangerous thing to our ideas of democracy.
Thanks for that, Ntokozo. Lisa, concluding thoughts and ideas?
Yes. I mean, I think the first thing is that we must stop thinking that change is an event. It's a single thing that happens, it's accomplished once, that's it, it's over and done with, and we now don't need to look back, we can just go forward to the glorious future. We have to see it as a process, and I think we also have to see it as an horizon. And I think we also have to take into account that as we change things, there are unanticipated changes that occur in response. So there's no kind of necessarily a preset outcome. And I think if you can start thinking about change as process and as more open-ended, then maybe that would help give us more flexibility to be able to think about it. So which is why something like men's only conversations are part of that process. And I do think under some circumstances, women don't want to hear those kinds of things. So much better that men work through whatever it is in their own company as part of that process before they get to another point where they can look back and see that they have thought differently. So I think the first thing is to think of it like that, because very often when I listen to people, it sounds like we have this model, and this is why I'm a little reluctant to put all our faith into conversation. You know, people don't just live in linguistic structures, they live in other very concrete and very material structures. And no amount of conversation is necessarily going to change those. So I think there's also a need to look at those concrete and material structures and how you may want to be something different, you may want to do something differently, but you are caught within in particular kinds of circumstances. So I think we have to look at conversation plus. In addition, and then I think lastly, we have this idea that we can make new things, but we make new things with what we already have, what is already given to us. So we need to be looking very carefully at what, and I think here is where Foucault and his ideas around genealogy become very interesting, is what is it that we are drawing from in order to craft what we think is new, but is quite possibly not. And just as a last example, since we're talking diseases, if you want a really good example of that point, have a look at the way people were talking about venereal disease at the turn of the 20th century, when it was the equivalent to what HIV was at the end of the 20th century. You will find language and discourse from 1910 that you could have dropped into 2005, and you would not have known that almost 100 years separated them. Yeah. So I think there's that to look at as well, is what are we making? What are the tools we're using? What are the discourses we're drawing from to create what we think is new?
Thanks for that, Lisa. Professor Africa?
I think that my fellow panelists have said it all. And I would just like to say that, you know, as Lisa said, that as we actually foster these new ways of seeing and doing, rooted in reality, as Ntokozo has said, as we strive to actually challenge men's conception and society's conceptions of men. Let us not forget that it remains women who are at the very bottom of the socio-economic and political pile, and that, you know, we should not be apologetic about ensuring that their status in society is forever forged ahead. I think that the fact that the majority of unemployed people are women, they occupy the most lowly paying jobs, if they work at all, that they are in their homes, actually the shackles, I think just signals to us that there's so much more to do as well in changing how society views women, and concretely doing whatever and all that needs to be done to change the status of women. If we do that, we'll also be contributing to building a better and more durable democracy.
Thank you, Professor Africa. Colleagues, friends, and fellow South Africans, thank you very much for joining us today. Bye now.